Hi, this is Trevor, and it's actually a balmy, let's see, Wednesday afternoon here in Winnipeg near the end of June, and just have a little free time. So I hadn't done any video blogging or vlogging in a little while, and I thought I would just maybe show something about some different artists' interpretations that work with tarot, and particularly some of my favorite decks that are based very closely on the Rider Waite. So enough of looking at me. I'm going to turn the camera around and we're going to look at what we have on the table today. These are three different decks that I like working with. Most of the time I work with the Rider Waite, and it is actually, I think, one of the decks that has more artists basing their interpretations on than any other. You know, tarot can be a very ornate symbolic language, but it's a language that only has 78 symbols, 78 pictures. Actually, I should say within those pictures there's a number of symbols that all evoke or express something. I think that the Rider is such a wonderful deck, not necessarily because it is the most artistically pleasing, but because Pamela Coleman Smith, the artist who illustrated the deck, was just that. She was an illustrator. She knew how to, kind of tell a story in terms of the picture she was creating. And she was working very closely with Arthur Edward Waite, the metaphysician who had commissioned her to create the deck. And they were both in an order called the Order of the Golden Dawn. This particular card that I'm looking at is called the Seven of Cups, and it has one of those fascinating little details that you kind of notice when you look more closely at the cards. There's sometimes a reason for everything there, whether it was intentional or not. Some things that people have come to see in the cards that maybe the artist didn't intend, but in this case it's quite purposeful, that hidden in this one cup here on the Seven of Cups you can see a little skull. So it's like when you go questing for power, you have to be aware of how that is fleeting and transitory, and that's just an interpretation. Like I said, there's many different associations people make with the cards, but over time you want to see that those associations are going to make sense when you go from one deck to another. So oftentimes I say when you work with the Rider Waite, it's like learning a language from somebody whose pronunciation and whose grammar is going to be helpful in terms of understanding other decks. You know, sometimes there's decks that kind of go off in their own particular tangent. Now, this is a very lovely deck that's based very closely on the Rider Waite. The artist chose to have some of the cards almost verbatim the same kind of image, but a very different style. This deck was created in the 1970s by an artist named David Palladini, and I think it's very similar to the kind of Art Nouveau style we saw, kind of coming back into popularity in the 1970s with rock posters and albums, and I remember posters like this being on my older brother's walls, and particularly the group The Grateful Dead had very ornate sort of Art Nouveau style. Now the interesting thing is that Palladini, who was creating this deck at that time, I don't think that he had the same depth of understanding at this time as he did years later. He created another deck in the last 2 decades, last decade or so, that is called the Palladini Tarot, and it's a beautiful deck, but it doesn't seem to have the same inspiration this one does, at least to me. It's a beautiful deck in its own right, but this one just has something quite magical about it. And I think it may have been possibly just how he was inspired by Pamela Coleman Smith's original designs, because there certainly is that influence. But he's done some very unique things here. Just an insight, the curved lines that you'll see coming up in the design of the cards are oftentimes meant to represent that which is not yet manifested. So it's like things that are still formative, things that are not, so set in place. Whereas you will see at other points on the card, so I'm just going to try and get that in focus, that there will be these more firm or crystalline lines, like where there's the very straight lines. That's what's kind of more set in stone. You'll see them here on this figure coming through. So this is part of how that would work through. And it's the different things that an artist will use to kind of express the idea, the feeling, the essence of things. Right. Another deck that kind of works with that same, individual artist's expression, but following closely again on the designs of the Rider Waite, is this deck here called the Morgan Greer. The artist is actually a fellow named, I think it's Bill Greer, and he was creating this deck around about the same time as the Aquarian came into publication. So they're sometimes known as sister decks. And Bill Greer was working under the guidance of a fellow named Lloyd Morgan. And they were creating this deck based partly upon the designs found in, again, the Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a metaphysical society, and the Rider Waite deck, but coming up with their own style and interpretation. Look at, how we have, very similar things, the sort of protective female figure on this card, the stained glass window, the pentacles, and the wounded figure. But a bit of a different feeling comes through in the Morgan Greer deck than in the Rider. So it's a bit of a different slant on the same kind of image, and it evokes something a little differently. Part of why I like working occasionally with the Morgan Greer deck is the tremendous vivid sense of color. And the colors are meant to be inspirational. And when you study in these areas and when you meditate, color itself has a vibration. People talk about sometimes seeing auras. And what I believe, this is just my own interpretation, is that it's not so much the physical seeing, but it's what the consciousness translates as that color, and what color then can inspire in the consciousness. So I'm sorry I'm being a bit technical about some abstract things, but putting it very simply, the colors in this deck really inspire. There's a sense of what they kind of trigger in terms of our interpretation. We have a beautiful symbol here, the Eight of Cups, and in the original deck too, in the Rider, or I should say earlier, not original, because there's been many decks before that. We have a similar image of a figure kind of making their way along, maybe not a clear road to follow. The moon in this card is waning. So it's like we're kind of coming into the darker period of the moon time and having to kind of feel our way along, and the gap in the cups suggests a sense of seeking, something missing that we are looking for. So that would be sort of a similar association we'd make from deck to deck, but maybe a bit of a different feeling or different slant in the interpretation because the artist is kind of expressing things in their own way. So that's just an idea of how different artists are kind of expressing something using maybe color or something like in the Palladini deck, the geometry, the ornate design, the little details that sometimes say different things to different people. And of course, if you're interested in different decks, the location that I'm working through right now, which is Elemental Book and Curiosity Shop, just coming out here into the store right now, has a wide selection of decks. There's a number of different artist styles and interpretations to be found, and Dominique is very knowledgeable in terms of what she sells. Coming back, this is the reading area, and I also recommend that you check out, there's some useful links on my website, and that is trevorsense.com. Particularly, if you're interested in different decks, I really recommend Eclectic Tarot. That's spelled AECLECTIC, Eclectic Tarot. There's a link for that on my website under useful links, because there are literally thousands of different artists' interpretations out there. You can find the deck that's right for you. So it's been fun talking tarot with you, and we'll be back talking to you again soon. Take care, and happy summer, everyone.